Great. Well, thank you very much indeed for that. And I think they're helpful comments because they do link where we've been in the last couple of days with where we're at today. And whilst what we've been through in the last 2 days are a range of perspectives on those key themes around crisis and commemoration, today picks up on perhaps some threads and themes that have been perhaps a little under the surface and brings them more clearly out for open discussion. I'm talking particularly about the focus on religion and identity in Europe and Australia. And we have a number of different ways of getting into that. Apart from more work in this room, we'll also have the opportunity to look around the museum and have some sense of how the museum is engaging with those themes and trying to make sense of them for a wider audience. And at the end, we'll get to have some more general reflection and conversation to draw out your thinking over a glass of wine or whatever. So that might loosen tongues even more than they are at present. In this first session, I'm delighted to be able to welcome one of my colleagues, Professor Jacqueline Lo, who is here. You've been down there. Welcome, Jackie. Jackie is the director of the ANU Centre for European Studies. Her research focuses on race, colonialism, diaspora, and the interaction of cultures and communities across ethnic, national, and regional borders. She's written a number of different books: Staging Nation, Performance and Cosmopolitics, as well as editing special issues. And she's currently completing a book on Asian Australian cultural politics. Jackie's topic is going to be migration and memory. And then after Jackie, we'll have a presentation from Shakira Hussain. Welcome, Shakira. It's terrific to have you with us. Shakira is undertaking a Mackenzie postdoctoral fellowship on Muslim women, gender violence and racism at the National Centre of Excellence in Islamic Studies at the University of Melbourne. Her writing has appeared in publications including the Griffith Review, the Best Australian Essays, the Australian in the Age, New Matilda and Crikey, and her topic will be Gert Wilder's tour in Australia. Firstly, to Jackie. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks everyone. I'm going to try, can you hear me? I'd rather be able to come out here than hide behind the podium.
Oh, there's the mobile.
That's too scary. Okay, it's fairly informal. So let me just get my mouse up. Can you hear me? Back? Everything. So I really just want to pick up on a couple of threads that we've been engaging with over the last 2 days, and yesterday in particular. Ben talked a little bit about the history boom of the 80s and 90s, and there's this notion of, kind of a histrionitis, where there was a particular nationalized narratives of World War I. I want to pick up a little bit more on, in fact, how this histrionitis has become so pervasive around the story of the Holocaust, in particular in Europe. And I know many of you have been to Europe and you would have visited many of the memorials in Belgium, in Germany, etc. And so I just want to pick up, firstly, a little bit about this notion of, the history boom and the industry of history as well. I'm not a historian. I work in performance and cultural studies, so this is a very particular take on it as well. And I'm particularly interested in what Ben was referring to, the politics of memory making, how we come to, what do we do with the past? History is so central, we've been talking about, to identity, but how do we represent history? In the case of Germany, for instance, how do you represent a history of war, a history of genocide, where you're culpable? And how do you engage with that? And how do you engage with that in the face of a changing demographic in terms of your population, just as we are in Australia, of an increasingly multicultural population? So how do you then engage with that history of Germanic past? So I think you'll probably be able, and I'll be referring to, I guess, the clues of how to connect with the ways in which we, as Australians, deal with our own histories of trauma. We don't have anything as major as the Holocaust, but of course we do have many histories of war. And if you go to the Australian War Memorial, you see that Australian identity is very much founded on a series of war. And that's really the predominant narrative of our nations, the foundations and the making of our nation. So how do we think about how identity is built on this history? Let me just start by talking about how, when we talk about the politics of memory making, memorials don't just pop out of nowhere. Often there is a story. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about an example of dark tourism, how the history of the Holocaust, the story of the Holocaust has actually become corporatized and assailable, which is quite a mind-boggling idea. But of course it is. In Europe you can just Google. If you do Google dark history or dark tourism, you'll find many companies actually offering to organize tours that you can go on to visit various concentration camps. For instance, Krakow has, cafes. There's a whole huge boom in kosher cafes, for instance, to cater for tourists from the US, tourists from Israel, etc., coming to visit. So it's a very interesting way in which how these stories have actually created industries around it as well. The Belsen camp, for instance, one example, right after the war, it really fell to neglect. It was not seen as important to commemorate or to even mark it. It actually returned to heath. Some of the buildings were razed and nothing was happening. It only became, it emerged back on the radar around about the late 50s when students who had been reading by Anne Frank, because of course Anne Frank and family were brought here from the Netherlands, started to lay flowers in Belsen. And then in the late 50s there was a period of anti-Jewish there was a kind of a resurgence of anti-Jewish movement, and there were synagogues that had been graffitied in Cologne, for instance. And so Konrad Adenauer, the chancellor, visited Belsen for the first time, I think in the 1960, and made a speech about how Jews were still welcomed in Germany. And that was when Belsen actually kind of emerged again as a place, but very much related to Jewish history, seen as a place, a Jewish site, which of course it wasn't only the Jews. Then in the international scene, Belsen became known in the 80s because Ronald Reagan made a trip to Germany. And it was a kind of controversial trip because he went to another camp where they actually had SS soldiers there that commemorated as soldiers or noted them. And so they included Belsen in his international, this visit. And so Belsen then became much more of a named space in the North American horizon. And then much later on, various Helmut Kohl on the 40th anniversary visited Belsen. It was one of the few times that you had, I think it was his first visit to a concentration camp at that point. So it was only around that period, we really are talking about the mid-80s, when the Lower Saxony government then decided, we better do something about it. And they put in an exhibition. It was kind of a temporary exhibition space, but eventually that then was developed into a more official site. So what we assume when we go to these commemoration sites, we assume that a lot of care, a lot of thought went into creating it, but in fact often it's a potted history of political contingencies that have led to the ways in which these exhibitions come together and the stories that they tell. So again, it's picking up on what we have been talking about, that these narratives are often revisited and revamped according to the conditions of the moment. And it's only the year 2000, that the federal government took on and started to pay some money towards the preservation and development of the site, to the point where we now have big gates, etc. And so it gives you an idea, I hope, of how these ceremonies that we assume have been going for a long time are in fact recent. It's a notion of recreating tradition. And that notion of tradition is often a very young tradition. Okay, well, what I wanted to, and the other interesting thing, and again, it's indexical of the kinds of issues that the commemoration sites of trauma, Holocaust sites raise. There's much debates and controversies with the designs of the Nelson came up. The designer wanted native German flora only. They couldn't make it too beautiful. They couldn't make it too peaceful. They had to. There was a lot of pressure that it had to be. It was a sacred space, a space of mourning and grief. So you couldn't beautify. You couldn't aestheticize that too much. So how do you represent that in physical terms? A site of trauma of this kind, beyond the graphic images in the exhibition site. How do you actually? What do you do with that space? When the designer asked for only native flora to be used, there was controversy over that as well, because that was seen as an assertion or a resurgence of German nationalism, of course. And so, well, in that case, what do you do with spaces of this kind? What kinds of symbolism are appropriate? How much? How little? What does it tell? Whose stories? So how do you keep memory alive? How do you keep these stories alive? And who owns the rights to tell this story? And in the case of Germany, that's really, really crucial, because it's a story of, you're telling a story of the vanquished, but who is actually creating those stories? So these are the sorts of issues that in Germany, it's very much part of the work of people in the arts sector, in museums, and the ways in which they engage with policymakers. How do you keep stories alive? And some of you would have been to the very famous memorial for the murdered Jews, the Holocaust, also called the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. It's again very new. It was only inaugurated in 2006. So 2006 was 2005. Ideas started around 2000 for it. Amazing site. It's something like close to 5 acres right in the middle of Berlin, near Potsdam Platz. And it's created on this kind of undulating terrain so that you can see the movement. And these are stelas. They are concrete bunker-like. So it was a cemetery. It's incredibly beautiful. If you go any season of the year, it changes. The colors change across the light of the day. It's a site for public official commemorations. It's a site for quiet individuals, schools go through. But you get photo shoots there as well. So again, this design raised some controversy because Eisenman, the designer, steered away from symbolism, did not go for anything overt. There's actually very little there that tells you what it is. There's an information center underneath which is quite a lot more explicit and it tells you what happened. But if you go there, there's just a little plaque that just says, this is the memorial, and that's it. And people meet there. It's a tourist site. Obviously, the school kids go play. My girl was running around at first, not knowing what it was. They think it's a playground. People meet for picnics. They have lunches. Office workers would come, and some of them would sit on top and chat. Teenagers use it as a meeting point. So it's a kind of an interesting space that comes back to the idea of whose memory is it, and to keep memory alive, for who owns those memories. And Eisenman did not want this space to be just a commemoration site that said, okay, we've commemorated this event, let's move on. How do you keep that story alive by making it user-friendly and part of an ongoing community? How do you make it something that people feel that they own? So in a way, yes, children can run around in it, but then they will be told what it means, and then they will relate to it differently. School kids come and they wander around and explore it, and so the relationship changes. People might have lunchtime there, but they also know what it symbolizes, but it's something that is connected with their day-to-day activities as well. So it's an interesting interesting relationship spatially that the designer wanted to do with it. So one of the key questions that artists, cultural activists have been playing around with is, how do you keep that story, a story that caused so much pain? How do you make that story something that the younger generation can relate to? And many Europeans who say, "Oh, so sick of the way in which that story of culpability has been told." We learn, as I think many of our students do, we learn about this story of genocide, when we were 6, and then in year 7 we go to Canberra, we go to Berlin, and then in year 8 we go again, because every year we get this in the curriculum, and they switch off because it's another story, it's a repetition again, and that narrative, that dominant narrative, is often one of the good guys and the bad guys. We talked a little bit about this yesterday. How do you inflect and nuance it? How do you make that much more nuanced in ways that they can find different entry points into it? And when your classroom is increasingly multicultural, how do you make that nuancing engaging to their diverse histories? It's not just one history that they can identify with, in terms of their subject positions. So some artists, for instance, and this is just a very quick one, Jacqueline Lo has done this fabulous. You can go and have a look at his website, there's lots of information about his work. But this is again as part of that kind of engagement and questioning and challenging of dominant ways of representing histories of trauma. Jacqueline, a very avant-garde artist, what he did in Saarbrücken Parliament there, he worked with art students in communities. This is the pathway to the Saarbrücken Parliament, it's actually an old castle. And he worked with Jewish communities in the country and identified 2,146 Jewish cemeteries that existed in Germany prior to World War II. And so with these art students, the art students pretended to be really drunk and rowdy one night and ran through the main part of the square in front of the parliament, and they dug up, amidst all that melee, they dug up those cobblestones and they replaced it with fake ones. And then they went back to the art school and they engraved in it the names of all these 2,146 Jewish cemeteries. And then the next night they had another big party. They came back, dug out the fake cobblestones, and they put it back into this alleyway, the original stones. Only, instead of putting them front up, the names of the Jewish cemeteries, they actually put it down. So hence it's actually called the invisible memorial. And that idea was that it is still there, but it's underneath. The names are present, everyone knows about it, but it's not in your face, it's not pedagogic, it's not something that tries to teach you something, but it's there, it's very much part of that collective memory making that we were talking about, how it moves from an individual memory into collective memory, and people are aware of it, and it's actually far more, in some ways, far more an interesting idea that still attracts people. People still talk about it, and it's seen as one of the ways in which it's not a history that tries to say, you must not do this again, but it's a history that teases, tantalizes, and makes you think about whose story and how. So it's an idea of the ways in which different people, different artists, different ways of approaching this idea of keeping history alive and offering different points of entry into nationalized histories. But the work that I've been doing really is about all these stories, all these artworks are really about making people care about history, making people care about what has happened, obviously with the hope that it would never happen again, but not from a black and white dichotomous relationship. But when our as the years go by, as our demographics change, as in Germany, in Europe, it's becoming increasingly multicultural, as it is in Australia. Those comfortable or those obvious subject positions between that black and white history is getting increasingly difficult to sustain. And so many people are asking, and many, for instance, Turkish Germans are asking, well, why should we care? We came much later on. Just as Asian Australians, when we've been having, prior to the apology, the whole series of storybooks and so forth, there were many, many interesting conversations held between migrant Australians with Indigenous and non-Indigenous white Australians saying, well, that's a really, reconciliation, that's a black-white relationship issue. It's got very little to do with Sudanese Australians coming in now. What's it got to do with us? Right? So why should we care, about the stolen generations? That's been one of the projects that I've been working on, and the short answer is for every reason to care, because we are all Australians, and we benefit from what Australia is now, and therefore we're also implicated in what it was in the past in order for it to be now. But secondly, of course, stories of mixed race continues, and stolen generation is as much a story about taking away black-white kids, the mix, as well as Asian Indigenous children as well. So that's part of the work that I've been doing. But the larger project with Europe has been what do Turkish Germans have to say? They too get pulled on buses in year 6, year 7, year 8, year 9 to go on these commemorations sites and to learn about this is what the Germans did to the Jews. Right? How do they react, and where is their space? How do they connect with these histories? So I'll just give you an example of two ways in which these new stories have come out. So the Stadtmutter is it's kind of mother's group or a neighborhood women's group, and they largely have projects. It's funded by government. It's largely they do education and how much time have I got, Bruce? 5 minutes. Education and health care, those sorts of things. But in Neukölln, which is one of the most mixed and high population of Muslims and Turkish, in particular, and Roma population in Berlin, the women said, in fact, we're interested in also in a little bit about German history. We want to know a little bit more about why Berlin is the way it is and why there's East and West Germany, etc. And so they it was a community project where these women, in fact, explored German history, the history of National Socialism. They went to Auschwitz. They made this film, which is called It's My History Too, and they talked to survivors. You see a picture up there and the next one as well. They talked to Holocaust survivors, and they made this project about what it means to them. And there were women from Turkey, there were women from Sri Lanka, there were women from Sudan, and they all connected with that history of genocide, but from their own perspectives and their own histories as well. And that it's a really interesting story, the way in which that history of genocide, much like what Tony Moore was doing last night, yesterday, how that nationalized history then becomes transnational as well. The ways in which they connected their own histories to Europe with what happened in the past. In the USB, I think you would have a copy of proofs of a recent essay that's coming out, an essay that I've just written that's coming out in a journal called The Text. And it's very active. Oh no, hang on, before I go to that, there's another comedian that you might find interesting. You can Google him, Sedan. Probably the works are not appropriate some of the videos, probably not appropriate for a classroom, but I think for you might find it interesting. It's a Turkish German, and what he's done is been performing for many, many years, and since about 2000, Bruce, if you don't mind, there's just some there's a little bit about him there, and you can just Google him. He's been doing readings of Mein Kampf, touring it through Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. He's got something, I think he's done something like 2,000 performances now. And he talks about Mein Kampf. It's again a particular Turkish-German commentary on Mein Kampf. And of course, Mein Kampf is still banned in Germany, right? The copyright for Mein Kampf is held by the Bavarian government. And the ban is due to be lifted in 2015, and there's much discussion about what's going to happen to it. Cologne academics in history, the University of Cologne, I can't remember now, have been working on an annotated Mein Kampf to try and demystify it and to point out its problems. And that project, and that was going to be the new Mein Kampf that would be released, that project was pulled a couple of years ago. So there's still discussions of what would happen. The president of the teachers' union in Germany have actually said they want to keep that ban. They do not want it to be released because of concerns about the Nazi movement continues. But what's interesting, of course, is that Mein Kampf is readily available digitally anyway. And so what Seda does is that he goes around, he actually makes fun, and he's a brilliant comic, a brilliant comedian, and it's ironic. He brings his own story to reading, and he tells basically Mein Kampf through his own stories. He runs, he's got shows called Hitler Kebab. Ridiculous things that are very confronting. There is an interesting video that you might find on YouTube called The Man with the Beard. And you can imagine who he's talking about, the Man with the Beard. It's a video, but again it points to the repression. It brings in that it wasn't just the Jews, it was the homosexuals. It's a very confronting video that you might want to have a look at as well. And so what Seda does, in short, is really to connect his own history and critique of Hitler and Nazism. So finally, that video to Fiona Tan, and I won't have time to talk much. What I do with critiquing her work is in that essay. She is interesting. She's part Melbourneian. She's born in Indonesia of Chinese father, Chinese-Indonesian father, Australian mother. Grew up in Australia, in Melbourne, went to university in the Netherlands, has been based there, is claimed as a Dutch artist, has represented the Netherlands in the Biennales. One of the works that I talk about in the essay is Provenance, where she was commissioned by the Rijksmuseum, the main museum in Amsterdam, to engage with their archives. And instead of working with the Rembrandts and the Vermeers, etc., she worked with images from lesser-known portraits of the Amsterdam elite and the bourgeoisie of the 19th century. And then she comments on her own images. So they are kind of these little video images. They look like Harry Potter Hogwarts portraits because they move very, very slowly. And they're images of contemporary Amsterdam. So the previous one was of artists. That's the son. A Turkish grocer, etc. So this is a contemporary Amsterdam that she's showing, which is contrasted to those portraitures of 19th century Europeans of different ethnicities. And she's made a book as well, and in the book there are lots of comments and stories that she tells. For instance, she points to this very famous painting, and she says, she hadn't realized until recently that the the word for orange, which comes from the French word, which is really, again, a reference to oranges from the East. So the ways in which colonialism travels and infiltrates even the use of language, which of course is so natural